because the Tokugawa shogunate was...
Strikes them head on. Lord, they're turning into flames. Now the whole field's covered by the woods of the cars. There's gas tanks for the automobiles spreading everywhere. Coming this way now, about 20 yards to my right.
Ladies and gentlemen, due to circumstances beyond our control, we are unable to continue the broadcast from Grover's Mill.
On August 14th, the Japanese government decides to accept the distasteful allied terms of unconditional surrender. Atomic warfare has made further resistance futile.
We aren't really sure what's happened. We're happy about the war ending, but I don't think everyone believes this thing about the atom bomb. I think it might be some kind of propaganda device that gives the Japanese a good excuse to surrender. Perhaps the Japanese said we dropped a bomb, and we're just going along with them. There aren't any big celebrations.
Now again, we now turn to Japan, and the first Portuguese ship blew into Nagasaki. And it was actually a storm blew them in, and they had Jesuits on board. And otherwise, it wouldn't have been for the storm, would have blown in. It was really kind of a bizarre story. But then the Jesuits made a very big stronghold in Nagasaki. Then they also made another one north of there in Hiroshima. And then the Japanese monarchy and the Buddhists realized after about 4 generations of what was going on, and that they were using this as a political means, not as that's where again. They weren't trying to get more people into Sunday Mass. That was not at all.
That's right.
They weren't. That was not the goal whatsoever. That was like a secondary type of thing. So the whole thing was political, and they superficially kicked out the Jesuits. They killed a bunch of them, but there was so much influence already at the time that it was already too late. And basically, it was more again of a gesture to do it more than really actually to do any type of purging. Had they had to really do a purge, they would have had to kill thousands of Japanese and also all along the way. But they just took out maybe 30, 40 Jesuits, and basically the influence stayed there.
If I might humbly disagree with you on that, for the listener's sake, that I covered in my book, I showed that they did kill, I think, around 20 or 25 Jesuits. I think they crucified them, and it was just a public execution. But when Ieyasu expelled the Jesuits in 1614, that was considered final, but they ultimately had to do that nobody could come into Japan, I believe around 1639. And the only ones they allowed to come to port in Japan were the Dutch Protestants because of Will Adams. And Will Adams was the English ship captain of a Dutch Protestant ship who warned the emperor of the Jesuits and who brought the British in to fight the Portuguese in a great big sea battle. And I believe about 30,000 Japanese were killed. So it was a big battle. And as far as I believe, it seems to me, the Jesuits were indeed kept out for about over 200 years until Commodore Perry and his gunboats come in 1854 and forcefully opened Japan to the British and to the Americans. And it's at that time that the Tokugawa shogunate is overthrown in 1867 because the Tokugawa shogunate was the abject enemy of the Jesuit order. They had to resign. They killed Emperor Komi because Emperor Komi was only 36 at the time, and he said, no white men are entering this country. We're not having any of these foreigners in here. And so he was assassinated, and they made his son, who was 14 years of age at the time, Emperor Meiji, and he ruled Japan for some 40 years. So based upon those things, I believe that Japan was a legitimate expulsion. And then look at the terrible punishment of the population of Japan during World War II. All the firebombing, the detonations of nuclear devices on the ground, I'd say. It was just a total destruction of their culture so it could be rebuilt into this commercial colony for the Jesuits.
Well, it's also, too, is that they resisted of doing any type of banking. As in versus that of China when they first came in, is that even though you had certain emperors coming through, there was still a lot of banking that was done through the Vatican system in China. Basically, they resisted this banking as much as possible in China, and I believe that was also one of the key things is why then, but they had enough influence, though, then to fearmonger with the Hirohito and the late 1800s, then to modernize per se and phase out the samurai as far as being military in Japan. And again, I believe that was a lot of it having to do, again, with, if you look at the history of Jesuit influence of arming them. Now you had Japan set up. Basically, again, now the major influences of the Jesuits were Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Isn't that interesting? Is where, quote, the bombs, quote, went off. And we discussed this before. This is how much more we got here, a little bit. Is that we now have what we discussed many times before, is that you had dirty bombs in the plains of the American plains. Yes. They dropped, and they had magnesium and they had uranium on the bombs themselves, but they made a kind of a big blast. But the actual mushroom cloud that we see today was actually a electromagnetic pulse device on the ground in the strongholds of Jesuit Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and exploded upwards. You had 8 Jesuits near 8 blocks away from ground zero. They emerge out of a bunker, and they say, well, the reason was because we were praying to the Virgin Mary. That's right. Why we survived.
That's right. And even Malachi Martin mentions that in his book, The Jesuits, The Betrayal of the Catholic Church, how they emerged from ground zero unscathed, no radiation problem, and attributed to the miracle of the Virgin Mary. Yeah.
Yeah. So
and by the way, for this, the Pedro Arrupe, who was there overseeing it all, was made Jesuit general in 1965.
Yeah, so that's interesting. Yeah, it just keeps on going.
It is now 1938, at the brink of World War II, when he is unexpectedly assigned to become a missionary in Japan. Already multilingual, Arrupe dives into his study of Japanese and a lifelong mission of intercultural understanding.
I must say that at the time, I did not focus on the transcendent aspect of the missionary experience, but rather on certain negative personal aspects, the discovery of a reality different from what I expected, and above all, the feeling of loneliness. And I experienced an even greater loneliness when I went to Ubi, 21 hours by train from Tokyo, for my first mission assignment, although I spoke Japanese only very poorly. Another important personal event was my imprisonment for 1 month in Yamaguchi. Japan was at war and I was suspected of espionage. I spent days and nights in the December cold, entirely alone. Many were the things I learned during this time: the science of silence, of solitude, of severe and austere poverty, of inner dialogue with the guest of my soul.
August 6th, 1945, begins as an unremarkable morning for Arrupe and his young Jesuit students on the outskirts of Hiroshima. The hum of an approaching airplane does not seem particularly threatening. They are used to hearing armadas of bombers overhead. Today, there is no siren to raise the level of fear.
So on August 6, 1945, when the first atom bomb fell on Hiroshima, Arrupe and his group were just outside the city limits. They heard it, and everything blew apart in the house. They didn't know what it was.
The fate of Father Arrupe and his novices is later filmed for the record by the American government.
Between 0 Point and the main building of the novitiate of Jesuits was a hill which served to lessen the intensity of the blast. Yet, despite this protection, the glass in the doors of the main entrance foyer were shattered, and the paneled ceiling was blown loose by the force of the explosion occurring 4 miles away. A group of Jesuits who were teaching in Hiroshima witnessed and survived the explosion. One of them has provided an eyewitness account.
I am Father John Zemus, professor of philosophy at the Catholic University of Tokyo. It is under management of the Jesuit fathers.
What were you doing in Hiroshima at the time of the explosion?
Well, my philosophical class was evacuated from Tokyo to Hiroshima about 5 months ago, and I was staying with my class at a house of studies at the outskirts of the city of Hiroshima.
Could you describe exactly what happened in the morning of August the 6th?
I was in my room, which faces the valley, and suddenly I saw a light, like magnesium light, flashlight, which filled the whole valley. And looking out of my window to find out the reason for this peculiar phenomena, I saw nothing besides this light. And turning from the window to the door of my room, I heard a crash. It may have been 10 seconds after seeing the light, the flashlight. And immediately I was covered with splinters of the window frames and glass sticking into the walls and actually in my flesh itself. After a while, we saw a procession of people coming from the outskirts of the city up the valley. Many of them, most of them, were wounded, especially the parts of the body which were not covered by clothes, like hands, feet, back. They came up to our house, and we did what we could, but there were no possibility to give much of aid.
What is your opinion as to the story that the ruins of the city emit a deadly ray?
Well, I think that it's just a rumor, because I myself and others of us have worked in the city itself immediately after the explosion for several hours, and we felt no ill effect at all.
In future years, Arupe would be called upon many times to tell his story, beginning immediately with U.S. newspaper reporters and military investigators.
What were you doing in Hiroshima at the time of the explosion?
Suddenly, we saw a blinding light, like a flash of magnesium. We heard a formidable explosion. After about 15 minutes, we noticed that in the direction of the city, dense smoke arose. We climbed a hill to get a better view. Before us was a decimated Hiroshima.
Father Arupe, he's been famous for that, for having been one of the witnesses of the falling of the first atomic bomb.
I shall never forget my first sight of what was the result of the atomic bomb.
I think it's fundamental. I begin my biography with the moment the bomb was dropped onto Hiroshima, and he's there below. In the burst, the spiritual explosion that is produced in him at the moment he stops and sees the watchtower stop at 8:15. The tremendous energy that results helps cure 150 sick who show up at his hospital thanks to a bottle of boric acid that he finds.
Assuredly, it was in such moments of tragedy that we felt God most near to us.
And this seems to have marked him very much. A kind of feeling of having been close to the end of the world, to have been present to one of the most dramatic events of the history of mankind.
Oh, a parking ticket! I was gone 5 minutes! Oh, how could this day get any worse? Oh my God.
Another thing that people have taken as a given that seems to be, that could possibly be a complete fabrication. It might be another offshoot of this Mason's plan to just siphon off a bunch of money from the space program, but also siphon a bunch of money from the nuclear weapons program, because it seems like, and this was only brought to my attention through you and your post about it and the footage that you've shown, it seems like at least the test footage that we've seen of a lot of nuclear weapons from back in the day when they're telling our parents to duck and cover under their school desk to protect them from a nuclear blast, and you got the air raid sirens going off. Obviously, our entire culture was completely paralyzed by the idea of nuclear weapons. But when you're looking at the test footage, given back then it might not have looked fake. You know, back then they actually thought King Kong looked real in the movie, or Jaws looked real in the movie, but now we can see it's clearly fake. When you look back at that footage, it's oftentimes, it looks like the scale of, say, a subdivision where you're in an empty lot across the street aiming a camera at a farmhouse on the other side of the street, a lot over, and then the blast hits and the farmhouse just gets destroyed. The house just gets ripped apart. But what happened to the camera? You know, who's filming that? The camera is only a couple 100 feet away from that. And in some videos, man, this is the most compelling, is the blast comes from behind the camera. What the hell is that? The blast comes from behind the camera and the house gets blown away out into the background of the shot. And you're like, what kind of camera in that day and age could survive that blast, but an entire building can't? I mean, it seems way out there. You've changed my mind on a little of this. You dipped my needle further into the fringe for sure.
Yeah. So it's just another way to get us scared into giving them more money. So we're giving them hundreds of billions of dollars in this space race that America and Russia were doing, and they also did the Cold War. So they scared us into this nuclear scare, and then stole a bunch more money to build fake nuclear weapons. And so yeah, the nuclear weapons don't exist as such. The tests that you've seen, the very early ones like you were talking about, are clearly fake, just done on models. Some of the later tests were done using stacked dynamite. You just get a shitload of dynamite and blow it all up, and it makes the mushroom cloud, does the whole thing. And what they do is they'd tell one team that, you know, they'd have a bunch of people 20 miles away, say army guys watching, doing the test, and then you've got over on one island these people stacking dynamite, saying that we're doing this for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be over on that island. Meanwhile, they got another team over on that island stacking dynamite for comparative purposes, and the real nuke's going to be on the other island. So they even have military men stacking dynamite that they know is being used for these supposed nuclear explosions, but they believe that they've seen a real nuke, even though they tell them to cover your eyes and put your head in your laps as it happens. You don't see anything until the smoke clears afterwards. But yeah, a lot of military men will swear, you know, up and down that nukes must exist because they were there at some of those tests, and it's just dynamite. They do it beneath water by stacking dynamite in submarines, and they can do it up in the air as well. The Hiroshima and Nagasaki nukes, you can see that they're clearly two superimposed explosions, one on top of each other. There's two smoke plumes made to look like they're one. I actually used this technique several times. If you look at this nuke footage, there's if you go to my website, Nuclear Weapons Do Not Exist, you'll see these 3 documentaries that expose the thing completely. And so not only do so for instance, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, what happened is that they were firebombed. So the cities were leveled just like Tokyo was firebombed, and the damage is comparable. But they claim that it all happened from one blast. But this is clearly not true, because flowers and plants started growing within a month, and they say nuclear radiation would exist for hundreds, thousands of years and would cause birth defects and everything. But nowadays, Hiroshima's a bustling city. Everyone's living there. Everything's growing there. Radiation's not a problem. There is some radiation after any explosion, so you would be able to go there with a Geiger counter and get some radiation, especially right afterwards, but it dies down quite quickly. And nuclear power, one of the most prominent nuclear physicists in America, he's dead now, Galen Windsor. He was involved in setting up most of the nuclear power plants in America. And he went all over America for years giving this lecture about how nuclear power is just the most expensive and effective way to boil water, and they're essentially steam plants, and that's all it is. The nuclear component that supposedly causes all this radioactive waste that needs to be, hazmat dealt with, and they drill holes into bedrock and put the nuclear waste deep under the earth, and they've got all these crazy regulations. He says, when we were first working with nuclear material, uranium, plutonium, we held it in our hands, and if some of it got hot, we'd throw it in the water, and that was it. No problem. He said, I would bathe, I would swim in the pool there that we would throw the radiated metals into, no problem. People thought he was crazy. He started drinking a glass of water from it every day, no problems. And then in his lecture, he started eating radioactive waste. So you can see on YouTube, type in Galen Windsor, and he'll take out a Geiger counter, show you some radioactive material. He'll take it out of a tube, and they'll say, I've just caused an EPA, if the EPA was in here, we'd have to clear out this whole area for half a mile, and people would have to come in with hazmat suits, blah, blah, and then he puts it back in the tube, and there's some left over on his hand. So then he licks his hand, shows the waste on his tongue, swallows it, and says, I've been doing this for years. And so the idea is just another fear campaign. And that's why they get the military involved in all these nuclear power plants and the nuclear weapons. It's to siphon off money, keep us afraid, and keep us playing off one another. Everybody thinks that, Russia and America are enemies, and that the Cold War is real and the space race is real. But it's all just, they're all like WWE. It's like Hulk Hogan and Macho Man. They're all paid by Vince McMahon. They all go out to eat together. If you're high up in politics anywhere, for sure you're part of this brotherhood that controls everything. There's no independent man at the head of any state. And if he was, what's he doing? The only type of government that should exist is a government that doesn't tax or perform violence on its people. So the only kind of candidate I would vote for is someone who's for the abolition of all taxes and legislation other than common law. If you hurt or harm a person or their property, theft, or breach of contract, those three things, those common laws, are the only things anyone should ever have to go to court for. Everything else is a victimless crime, and this is the big system that they get us caught up in. So they've got millions of statutes and acts that supposedly ignorance of the law is no excuse. So if you break any of these millions of legislations, they've got reasons to fine you or kidnap you and put you in jail, or even murder you if you don't pay them up. So I don't vote. I don't recommend voting. If you could get out of paying taxes, I'd recommend that too.